Before I begin, I'd like to thank all of our volunteers and donors who've made this webinar possible. Your generosity helps us live the legacy of C.S. Lewis and to spotlight the work of others who are doing the same. Our sponsors for this virtual summit are Preservation of Elegance, Dr. and Mrs. G. Wesley Vick III, Kevin and Mary Ann Dibley, and Joshua George. I'd like to open with a prayer which helps us to set our hearts and minds on things above. Would you please pray with me? Grant us, Lord, not to be anxious about earthly things, but to love things heavenly. And even now, as we live among things that are passing away, to hold fast to those that shall endure. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. I'm going to pivot right now to welcome longtime friend Lancia Smith, who is going to introduce Andrew Peterson, our next presenter. So Lancia is going to join me on the screen. Lancia is an author, photographer, speaker, and business owner. She is a grateful lover of the triune God and is passionate about disciple making. She's the founder and executive director of the online magazine Cultivating, which is dedicated to encouraging Christians engaged in the arts, and its discipling initiative, the Cultivating Project. Lancia is a longtime friend and supporter of the C.S. Lewis Foundation and is an active board member and patron of our friends, also the Anselm Society. Lancia is president and CEO of a thriving environmental engineering and construction firm based in northern Colorado, which she runs with her husband, Peter. So I have no idea when she sleeps. Lancia loves coffee, so maybe that's where she doesn't sleep. And she's also a beautiful, beautiful photographer and artist from the very well-rounded perspective. Lancia, welcome. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you. It's such a joy to be here. It is my privilege to get to introduce our next speaker, Andrew Peterson. And I really appreciate all of that, Amber. Thank you. It was just gracious. You bring such a warmth to all of this. And it's hard to do that when we're all doing this virtually. So just every little bit of twinkle we want to scoop up and keep with us. So let me tell you a little bit about Andrew Peterson. Andrew is somebody that many of us already know, and we know very well. It's likely that many of you have already met him through a number of his creative endeavors. I think it would be fair to say that Andrew is a Renaissance man in our times. And in that respect, he shares that quality in common with our friend Malcolm Guite. Andrew is an acclaimed singer, songwriter, musician. He's the creator of the much-loved Behold the Lamb of God tour. He's the power and the voice behind Resurrection Letters. He's the writer of the new hymn, Is He Worthy? That already feels like we've been singing it all our lives. He is also the award-winning author of the Wingfeather Saga. Wingfeather captivates both the children and the grown-ups who read it to them. I know this to be true. And he is also the author of the marvelous book, Adorning the Dark, Thoughts on Community, Calling, and the Mystery of Making. He is the founder of the Rabbit Room, a thriving and prolific community of musicians, artists, writers, and creative sorts of every persuasion, and the celebrated annual gathering called Hutchmoot. Many of you who have attended Oxbridge before will know him as our closing plenary speaker for Oxbridge 2017. He inspired us with his self-effacing humor, his wit, and his very vulnerable storytelling. But as we each are, Andrew, of course, is more than the sum of his achievements. He's also a husband of Jamie, the father of 3 much-loved children who are now each pursuing creative arts themselves. He is a landowner who loves his land, and he builds dry stack stone walls, an old skill to be sure. He is a voracious reader. He is a beekeeper. He is a lover of C.S. Lewis and the Inklings. He's also kind, funny, honest, generous, and wise. Most essentially, though, what we need to know about Andrew Peterson is that he's a lover of Christ, and he is a champion of Christ's kingdom. Andrew set his life to using his own gifts as given him to tell the truth and to tell it as beautifully as he can. When I think of someone who is living the legacy of C.S. Lewis, Andrew Peterson is a marvelous embodiment of that. And today, he is going to talk with us about the fingerposts to the new creation. So please welcome Andrew Peterson.
Thank you so much, Lancia. Can you guys hear me okay? We good?
Yep.
I am so honored to be a part of this, and that is a very humbling introduction. It's very kind of you. Thank you. You have been kind to me from the moment I met you years ago, so thank you for that. I don't have much time, so I'm going to launch right in pretty quickly here. Goodness gracious, Malcolm Guite, thank you for the gift that you are to the world. I was sitting here crying as you were reading. I kind of still have a lump in my throat because of the way your poems wake up a longing in me for the face of Christ and for the new creation. I was just talking to my daughter today via FaceTime. She's in school in England right now, up right near the Lake District at the edge of the Dales at a place called Capernwray Hall. And she was telling me that she was reading a Henry Nouwen book, which is what you want your teenage daughter to tell you, right? That she's reading Nouwen and being moved by this. And she told me that Nouwen was talking about how some people are the prisoners of now, which means that they're so caught up in the day-to-day that they sometimes lose sight of the future and the past, and they kind of get lost in the weeds. And she was telling me in this wonderful moment of insight that she said sometimes she feels like she is the opposite, that she is a prisoner of the future and of the past, and she cannot pay attention to the now. And I thought that was so wise of her to and discerning of her to notice about herself. And that's what I'm going to talk about, is about how beautiful and important it is to pay attention to where we are now, because heaven is always encroaching. That it is always, C.S. Lewis talks a lot about how, the suffering now is a part of the joy later, and so it doesn't do a whole lot of good to only think about what is to come or what is, or to pay attention to what is behind us, but to pay attention to now. Right behind me in the woods on our property, my friend Andy bought me a little statue of St. Francis that sits in the trees. And it's the reason he chose it for me was because it's in a lot of depictions of St. Francis, he's staring at the ground because his attention was not on some faraway heaven. His attention was on the birds and on the deer and the trees, and because those were the things that reminded him of what was to come. So that's what I'm going to get at here. So I'm just going to launch right in. I've never read this, so hopefully I don't go too long. Here we go. When I was a kid, I watched Bob Ross on a regular basis. His show, The Joy of Painting, was on the local PBS channel every weekday after school. So we'd bounce around from Scooby-Doo to whatever weird televangelist was in vogue at the time. We were entertained by Robert Tilton's wackiness long before the sound-altered videos showed up. You know the ones I'm talking about, probably. And then we would pop back to Bob Ross to see what progress he'd made on his painting of the happy little trees where the happy little squirrels lived. We loved the way he giggled when he cleaned his brushes on the leg of the easel. Bob was most definitely uncool with his afro and his hippie shirts and his whispery way of talking. But I think every child of the 80s and 90s secretly thought he was awesome, in the same way we secretly loved Fred Rogers. There was, however, one thing that I didn't like about Bob Ross's very cliche landscapes. At some point, about halfway through each painting, he would step back and inspect the snowy mountain lake overhung with firs, he would think for a moment and then lean in with his knife and add the roof line of a happy little cabin. Not the cabin, Bob, I would groan inwardly. Why can't it just be mountains without sullying things up with evidence of human settlement? Aren't landscapes enough? I had big ideas, passionately held, about the untainted West. Nothing sounded more romantic to me than riding a horse through an untouched Montana with nary a cabin in sight, a notion informed by films like Dances with Wolves and Lonesome Dove. Wherever humans come into contact with nature, I believed, chaos ensues. Since I had spent my youth in contact with nature, since I had spent my youth in two of the flattest places in North America, Illinois and Florida, you may be surprised to learn that Florida is actually the flattest state in America. Nothing stirred my longing for adventure like the thought of mountains. When we Americans go to a state park, that's what we're after, right? Pristine nature, an absence of billboard blight, vistas without power lines. And when we go on a hike in that state park, we bring a backpack full of granola bars, a bottle of water, and zero expectation of encountering civilization. We are heading into the wilderness, so we have to stock up. Goodbye, exile. Hello, Eden. Now, I get the appeal of what I've just described, though I've never been one for week-long backcountry hikes, thanks to an inherited set of unreliable knees. I do love a good sweaty tromp through the forest. If there are waterfalls, all the better. We've all done it. We drive an hour to the trailhead, lock the car, apply bug spray, take a deep breath, and then plunge into the forest for the next few hours, eventually either backtracking or looping back to our car and the weary drive home to our computers, and the righteous feeling of having taken in some nature. Verily, trees are good medicine, and so is silence, and an intentional pilgrimage to the wilderness. I think we'd all agree that people would be better off with a bit more hiking and a lot fewer screens. But over the years, I've come to see the wisdom of Bob Ross and what his predilection for happy little cabins represents. People, you see, weren't merely meant for wilderness. We were meant for a garden. As much as I hate litter, we weren't ultimately meant to leave no trace. We were meant, in Andy Crouch's words, to make something of the world. Culture, by his definition, is what we make of the world. I love the romantic ideal of untouched creation, but taken too far, it misses the fact that God gave us creation specifically to be touched, to be cultivated, to be dwelt in, to be encountered and loved and honored by his image-bearing children. It goes without saying that we've made quite a mess of things, which is why state parks are so precious and so necessary. I hope they last forever. But I would argue that the idea that you can either have a primeval wilderness or a sprawling and destructive city is a false dichotomy. If the goal is unspoiled nature, well, the trick is to avoid spoiling it. And the way to do that is to responsibly engage with creation, to make a way for the next generation to fall in love with it. If they love it, they'll care enough to steward it well. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but America hasn't stewarded it well. And I don't just mean that from an environmental standpoint, though that's certainly true. I mean towns, cities, infrastructure, the places where human beings live out their humanness. James Howard Kunstler's book, The Geography of Nowhere, traces the history of how America got to where it is. And where is it? Well, we tend to live in places that are sequestered from nature, so that most of us work in cities or suburbs with flimsy half-baked versions of nature and culture. No places, quote unquote, according to Kunstler. We work there all week long, and then we plan occasional trips to the state parks to balance things out. I'm so glad parks exist. They're symbols of our need for silence, our need for growing things, for rest and play. On the other hand, I wonder if they've added to our American idea that human life happens on one side of the street, while nature's life happens on the other. And never the twain shall meet. Isn't it odd that in order to experience the glory of nature, we Americans have to get in a big metal car with an internal combustion engine and drive somewhere just to walk in a big loop for a few hours and then come home to our screens? Some might argue that the suburbs provide an answer to this, what with our subdivisions on the edge of town, complete with lawns and sidewalks and impractically small front porches. Isn't that a decent integration of culture and nature? Kunstler would say that our American love affair with suburbs is merely another no place, which neither honors the places where we live nor the humans who live there. According to Kunstler, one of the major factors that led to the placelessness of our communities was our country's idea early on that, quote, land was first and foremost a commodity for capital gain. Land wasn't first and foremost God's precious gift for us to steward, a garden to tend, a foundation of our communities tied directly to our flourishing as human beings. But rather as a way to get rich. As Kunstler writes, the commercial transfer of property would become the basis of American land use planning, which is to say hardly any planning at all. Somebody would buy a large tract of land and subdivide it into smaller parcels at a profit, a process that continues in our time. He goes on, nearly eradicated in the rush to profit was the concept of stewardship of land as a public trust, that we who are alive now are responsible for taking care of the landscape so that future generations can dwell in it in safety and happiness. This rush to profit, kicked into high gear by the invention of the automobile, led to the hasty planning of our towns and cities, with little thought given to either architectural aesthetics or the simple, practical, lovely things like cafes, farmers markets, shopping districts, functional walkways that people need in order to flourish in community as God meant for us to. Eventually, for a whole host of reasons that Kunstler lays out, America became a land of urban sprawl and subdivisions. And in doing so, we've cut ourselves off not just from the vast natural beauty of this continent, but also from the vaster beauty of community. We got our lawns, our 2-car garages, our flat screen televisions, and our quiet neighborhoods 30 minutes from town. And all we had to do was give up any hope of permanently settling down in a place we could all learn to love for the rest of our lives, our connection to the earth God made for us, and our life-giving reliance on each other. There is, of course, a theological component to all of this. And our Eric Jacobson, who's a pastor in Tacoma, Washington, got his PhD in theology and the built environment. It makes me so happy that one can get a doctorate in that. He dug into these issues in a book called Sidewalks in the Kingdom. He writes, in the Christian imagination, where you live gets equal billing with what you believe. Geography and theology are biblical bedfellows. Everything that the Creator God does, and therefore everything that we do, since we are his creatures and can hardly do anything in any other way, is in place. Place matters. Where we live and how we live there affects us spiritually and shapes our understanding of what it means to be the children of God. The neighborhood next to ours, right over there, is a nice little subdivision called Mill Run. By a stroke of good luck, the planners decided to line the streets with silver maples instead of those trees from the pit of Gehenna known as Bradford Pears. Bradford Pears, just so you know, are preferred by developers because they're cheap, they grow fast, and they produce malodorous but pretty white flowers in the spring, which happens to be when most home sales happen. It's devious. The downside is after the developers leave, the trees require regular pruning, a gust of wind can split them in half, and they're prolific, producing an inhospitable forest of non-native offspring that's riddled with thorns. I'm really fired up about this, as you can see. Left unchecked, they'll soon overtake all the lovely oaks, maples, sycamores, and ashes that are native to this part of the world. Take my word for it, they're awful. If you have a Bradford pear in your yard, for goodness sake, cut it down and spend $25 on a maple at Lowe's. Anyway, Mill Run, the subdivision, as I said, is a nice neighborhood complete with a greenway that follows the bends of Mill Creek and houses that rise on the shoulder of a gentle hill. Coming around the bend on Barnes Road, you can see Mill Creek glistening in the valley, and above the creek, the subdivision houses are clustered in what looks like a quaint English village, especially at dusk when the house lights are low. House lights are aglow. Truly, it's a beautiful sight, but there is something missing. After my first few visits to Europe and the United Kingdom, where towns are older than the United States by 1,000 years, I came home to culture shock. There, I had grown used to cities that came of age long before cars were invented, villages that were built when most people walked everywhere. The towns across the pond have narrow streets and shops with display windows. And if there's a river or a creek nearby, then you can actually see it because the houses were built right up to the banks for practical as well as aesthetic reasons. The houses were often built of stone, brick, or old timbers, or if they were of more modern wooden construction, they were built to last more than a generation or two. In every village, town, and city, there's an old church, any number of cafes or coffee houses, and a shopping district. The ones in England all have at least one village pub. In other words, there's commerce, a reason to go outside once in a while, a situation in which it's possible for you to bump into your neighbors. Humans, in general, want more than to merely live in a house. We want to be a part of the life of a community. Eric Jacobson says, just as it is difficult to imagine the concept of family independent of the home, it is near impossible to imagine community independent of the town square or the local pub. I like how he thinks. American subdivisions zoned as strictly residential allow nothing but houses. That means that unless you drive somewhere, there's no place to eat, no place to gather with your friends in a cozy nook next to a fireplace, no church to beautify the landscape or provide a place for worship, no integration with the nearby creek so that you'd actually know it's there if you didn't go looking for it. And here's the thing, most American subdivisions are about the size in population and area of those little villages many of us pine for. If I could change one thing about American subdivisions, I'd require them all to have a church, a cafe, a little grocer selling local produce and baked goods, a coffee house, and because I love C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, a village pub. If I couldn't get all of the above, I'd settle for the pub or a used bookstore or both. Who wouldn't want to go for an evening stroll and have a slice of pie at the local baker's where you might bump into a neighbor or two whom you haven't seen for a few days? I guarantee that everybody in town would want to live in that neighborhood. A few years ago, we got enough rain that the creek looked high enough to kayak. On a whim, I drove to the nearest Walmart and bought a plastic kayak for $100. And then I got Jamie to drop me off upstream. As I floated serenely down the creek, I realized that in all the years I'd lived here, 25 years in Nashville, I'd never considered the hidden world that lay just out of sight. Great herons laboriously took wing as I approached. Startled turtles dove from where they were sunning on fallen trees. Kingfishers swooped from branch to branch. Little falls of spring water fell musically from the steep banks. I saw towering sycamores, cottonwoods, pin oaks, sugar maples, black locusts, and green ashes. Families of ducks winged downstream until I reached them, then quacked and flew off again to wait for me. To my dismay, I also saw plenty of discarded tires and rusty washing machines. Occasionally, through all the brush, I heard people on the greenway not 20 feet away and was frustrated all over again that whoever planned the footpath cut them off from all this beauty. How hard would it have been? And if the people in the neighborhood knew how wondrous this ancient waterway was, would it be treated as a garbage bin for tires and old appliances? I doubt it. All this dreaming can certainly morph into a naive nostalgia for the elder days, when things were simpler and everybody had a horse and lived off their own land. But the truth is, our ancestors' lives were brutal. Just look at the photographs of haggard farmers in the late 19th century. No doubt they would have been grateful beyond measure for a Sunday drive to the shopping mall. To be clear, I'm not looking back, but forward. By integrating our many technological goods, cultural institutions, and even business ventures with a godly stewardship of creation and community, we could be that much closer to a vision of what God intended for humankind. Indeed, we're inviting the new creation into this present darkness. We're practicing resurrection, painting pictures of the kingdom as it will be in its fullness, undesecrating what was already sacred. Speaking of sacred, the city of Cambridge, England, is one of my favorite places in the world. I've only been there a handful of times, but I discovered a walk there that I think about at least once a week. The C.S. Lewis Foundation flew me over to do a concert and speak, a tremendous honor, so I had exactly 3 days to see what there was to see. I asked a few locals to recommend the best walk, and the consensus was Grantchester Meadows. I bought a map and struck out. After passing out of the heart of the ancient city, I crossed a few parks and uninspiring neighborhoods till I came to the meadow's edge. For the next 45 minutes or so, I was Samwise Gamgee, ambling along that low, quiet river through fields of cattle, under the shady boughs of willows and chestnuts whose limbs draped lovingly over the river. Soon the path veered away from the river and across a field to the orchard tea garden where posh Brits sipped and chortled. Now I was in the village of Grantchester, famous partly for the BBC mystery series of the same name, but especially for the war poet Rupert Brooke. My head full of stories, my heart full of gladness, I ate lunch alone at a pub called the Green Man and wrote in my journal, all was well with the world. It was only later that I discovered the rich history of that very walk. Way back in the 1300s, Geoffrey Chaucer wrote of the area in the Canterbury Tales. Rupert Brooke, whom Yeats called the handsomest young man in England, wrote these homesick lines about Grantchester Meadow before he died in World War I. And man, I wish Malcolm could read this. Oh, I'm not gonna do Malcolm's voice, but it's super tempting. Oh, there the chestnuts, summer through, beside the river, make for you a tunnel of green gloom and sleep deeply above. And green and deep the stream mysterious glides beneath, green as a dream and deep as death. Sylvia Plath's poem, Watercolor of Grantchester Meadows, pays tribute to the cows. It is a country on a nursery plate. Spotted cows revolve their jaws and crop red clover or knob beetroot, bellied on a nimbus of sun-glazed buttercup. Hedging meadows of benign Arcadian green, the blood-buried hawthorn hides its spines with white. The biggest surprise, though, was the Roger Waters penned Pink Floyd song, Grantchester Meadows, which calls us to, this is awesome, hear the lark and hearken to the barking of the dog fox gone to ground. See the splashing of the kingfisher flashing to the water, and a river of green is sliding unseen beneath the trees, laughing as it passes through the endless summer, making for the sea. This, my friends, is what happens when you don't build a subdivision or a shopping center over one of Earth's lovely places, but instead honor it and open it up for people to really see. It's what happens when the owner of those cows, unafraid of a lawsuit, allows the occasional rambler. For centuries, the place gets memorialized in song and story. It is experienced and cherished by people like me from faraway lands for its simple, timeless loveliness. In this way, we give the place a chance to speak, and it insists that we acknowledge its sacredness, its placeness, which leads to both our sharing of it and our caring for it. No great shock that I didn't see a single household appliance in the River Cam. So what is there to do but begin the patient work of hallowing what we have now and here? Just a few weeks back, I kayaked Mill Creek again with my brother. By the time we were in the water, the magic hour was upon us. The trees were aglow with it. As we floated through that quiet world of wonder, we heard joggers and walkers on the greenway just above us through the thick brush. They had no idea we were there, and probably didn't even think about the fact that just a few feet away, an ancient waterway carried on as it has for thousands of years. When I got home, I decided to begin the work of undesecrating Mill Creek by writing a poem. I doubt it's the first one written about Mill Creek, but it's the only one I know of. So here you go. Mill Creek in September. My brother and I took to the creek, 2 small boats plying the golden hour. Dodging wet stones at angles oblique, we listened to nearby walkers speak above the bank and beyond the bower. Our presence unknown, our course unseen, we glowed well below the world they knew, in our world of water and rushes green, where oak limb bowed to the heron queen, as kingfishers courting swooped and flew. Limestone embankments bordered and gleamed, where spring water trickled over moss and sang its tune as the late sun streamed its light through leaves until it beamed on lordly sycamores stretched across. And in the end, we left it behind. The sun left too, and now the warm night envelops the valley, strikes us blind. But I see the water in my mind, down below the bank in dark delight. In N.T. Wright's magnificent book, Surprised by Hope, he writes, the church that takes sacred space seriously, not as a retreat from the world, but as a bridgehead into it, will go straight from worshiping in the sanctuary to debating in the council chamber, discussing matters of town planning, of harmonizing and humanizing beauty in architecture, in green spaces, in road traffic schemes, and in environmental work, creative and healthy farming methods and proper use of resources. If it is true, as I have argued, that the whole world is now God's holy land, we must not rest as long as that land is spoiled and defaced. This is not an extra to the church's mission. It is central. We won't see that divine integration of nature and culture complete until, as the hymn says, Jesus who died is satisfied and earth and heaven are one. Yet even now, as I write these words, I'm reminded that this is my Father's world. This one that we've tarnished with injustice, broken communities, and its grayscape of asphalt. I long to see the Father's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven, a kingdom that isn't just a spiritual reality, but a physical one, as physical as Jesus' resurrected body. And the church's business is heralding that kingdom by putting our talents to work. That means loving our neighbors, our cities, our places. It means stewarding our time, widening our imaginations, and pursuing our endeavors in his name for his glory until the master of the house returns. Yes, Lord, establish the work of our hands. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was magnificent.
Oh, thanks.